In the French Alps, a drama unfolds as Samuel Molesky, lost in his music within the attic, creates a cacophony that leads his wife, celebrated German novelist Sandra Voiter, to postpone an interview. Their world shatters when Daniel, their visually impaired son, and his faithful guide dog Snoop stumble upon a scene of tragedy. Samuel lies lifeless beneath his attic window. As suspicion casts a shadow over the household, can their blind son's testimony light the path to truth, or will it deepen the darkness surrounding his family's fate? The movie starts with a happy family scene where Sandra is excitedly talking to a writer about her new book. Meanwhile, her son is busy bathing his dog. The interview goes smoothly until Sandra's husband starts playing his musical instruments so loudly that it disrupts their conversation. Sandra realizes her husband is trying to get her to end the interview, so she politely wraps it up with a smile. After the interview, the son takes his dog out for a walk, but when he comes back, the family's world falls apart. He finds his father dead in the snow, his body covered in blood. Sandra quickly calls the police, but the injury on her husband doesn't seem to match a simple fall. It looks like he was hurt with something sharp, and there are bruises all over his body. Sandra is heartbroken, and the police tell her that her husband has been dead for almost an hour. Her son Daniel was out with his dog all this time, unaware of what had happened. Sandra is exhausted from answering the police's endless questions about that morning. The police are puzzled because the details don't add up. They even ask Sandra to review everything again, thinking she might remember something new. Strangely, they consider Daniel a suspect, even though he's blind and knows nothing about the incident. This struggle is vital in Anatomy of a Fall. Daniel's partial blindness isn't just a story trick, it symbolizes the difficulty of seeing the truth because our minds struggle with conflicting feelings and uncomfortable thoughts. The police are determined to solve the case, noticing blood spatters on the wall that don't make sense. They recreate the interview scene in a studio, playing the same music and asking Sandra to recall her husband's fall, but finding out what happened is complicated. Meanwhile, Daniel has become withdrawn. He won't eat or talk to anyone. Sandra tries to help by inviting his grandmother over, but nothing changes. The cops are also skeptical about the nature of the husband's wounds. The case goes to court, where different theories about Sandra and her husband's relationship emerge. Sandra insists that her husband would play his instruments loudly whenever he was annoyed, and that day, he wanted to stop the interview because he didn't like the writer's questions. So he played his music loudly, and Sandra ended the interview, understanding his signal. Sandra says she uses earplugs and sleeps when her husband plays loud music upstairs. People find this hard to believe because her actions don't match her words. She can handle challenging situations, even when she feels unwell. The court questions why she would sleep through the loud music instead of checking on her husband even once. But Sandra believes her husband didn't like being disturbed while working. She also mentions that her husband had tried to end his life 6 times before, but everyone sees it as just another murder story. Meanwhile, Daniel has to share his version of events, but his story doesn't align with what was said before. Daniel thinks his story is changing because he's still in shock. The facts are still not clear, so the investigation continues. An expert analyzing the blood patterns thinks the 3 drops of blood came from a brutal hit on the head upstairs. How the blood drops are shaped and where they landed suggest he might have been pushed from a height. However, the officer leading the investigation isn't convinced by his theory since no weapon was found, and Sandra was asleep while Daniel was outside. Other experts think the husband fell from the top floor, hitting a part of the roof on the way down, which caused his injuries. The blood patterns support this theory, but there are still unanswered questions. For example, if he hit his head in a small room, why was there no DNA found there? The experts think the snow could have melted, destroying DNA evidence. Daniel is told to avoid the investigation because it might upset him. He wants to know what happened, but his mom and lawyer think it's best if he doesn't get involved. At the next court hearing, Sandra talks about her husband's recent suicide attempts. He had stopped taking his medication, which led him to try to end his life with aspirin. Sandra says they had a normal relationship, but slept in separate rooms. Sometimes, Sandra would wake up her husband, and one day, she found him not awake. His psychologist said he wasn't depressed but needed medicine to help him feel steady. However, the psychologist also shared that Sandra blamed him for their son Daniel's accident, which made Daniel blind. Sandra thought her husband had caused the accident, and she blamed him for many things, upsetting him. Sandra admits they fought after the accident, but thinks such arguments are usual for couples. She's become friends with one of the officers looking into her husband's death, trying to convince him she didn't do anything wrong. She also wants Daniel to know she's not guilty because she doesn't want her son to think she's the wrong person. On the day of the next court proceeding, they brought up a tale-off, according to which Sandra had a conflict with her husband on homeschooling Daniel and who should do what chores. The fights even happened because her husband worked around the house. Sandra was behind with her work because of writing, which led to arguments. Such judgment and even foul language were strewn at each other. Sandra didn't tell the truth to the lawyer about that fight or a bruise either. The audio recalls their relationship was on a downward path whenever Sandra was cruel towards him, and on some occasions he disappointed her. Sandra wanted to emphasize writing and have her move on without doing chores. While they were in the middle of a brawl, she muttered to him about being a failure. One day, her husband grabbed her too tight and she got a bruise. She rocked this and didn't admit it, or she would be deemed a suspect. In contrast, the original assumption of the people is starting to waver. He even shows them pictures of the sadness he had done to their house and the injured hand. But despite anybody casting a spell on Sandra, she is still the prime suspect. Roughly, Daniel is aware his mom has a boyfriend, and they have been fighting a couple of times. When asked about her other experiences with seeing a person's things, he, the husband, was all good for that since they were a couple with open principles. The recordings complicate things because they show Sandra might have started the fight on purpose, knowing she was being recorded. She knew her husband had been recording her for a while and didn't mind. But now, she wonders if the recordings were made to blame her for starting arguments. The judge decides to pause the case for the weekend and puts Daniel under house arrest, where he can't meet or talk to anyone. Sandra has to stay quiet to protect her son, and a woman is hired to stay with Daniel. However, Daniel chooses to be alone all weekend, not wanting his mom nearby, which upsets Sandra. She tries to talk to him, but isn't allowed, and leaves to spend the weekend in a hotel, crying because she feels even her son doubts her. There is a considerable risk that Daniel will do a hazardous experiment by giving too much aspirin to a dog. The dog may become very sick. The next day, with the woman's help, they successfully stop the death of the dog by potting the salt water. After that, the dog acts completely different, being slick and not so speedy. Daniel believed that was the way to prove that his dad was trapping his anxieties inside the surgical aspirin, and the dog behaved alike after taking the pill. Daniel recalled a trip to the vet with the dog and his dad. While on the way back, the latter talked about dealing with an impending loss, despite the fact they may have been dangerous, the aspirin tablet. Now, Daniel realizes his dad mentioned that he was absent of the support he always had from you. There's no reason for me to live anymore, which could only mean he was referring to himself. Daniel comes to terms with the fact that his father chose to end his own life and that Sandra, his mother, didn't play any role in that tragic decision. With this understanding, Daniel speaks up about a recent conversation with his father, which helps clear his mother of the accusations against her. As a result, Sandra is released and they return home, maintaining their dignity and respect despite the troubles in their relationship. Although Sandra was tough on her husband, blaming him for many problems and even being emotionally harsh, she never physically harmed him except for one slap. Now she feels guilty that Daniel knows everything about their family issues. Her life, once private, has been exposed for all to see. However, she's relieved to return home, and Daniel awaits her. The movie concludes with them sharing a warm hug and finding peace after the turmoil they've endured. But is Sandra genuinely guilty of anything more than what's been shown? The film closes on this note, inviting the audience to form opinions about her innocence or guilt.